Hi, this is NextGen Picks. I had this $800 U8 Hisense running right next to a $1,600 Samsung QM8 yesterday. And the weirdest part wasn't that the Hisense matched the Samsung in raw brightness, it's that it actually made the Samsung look a little washed out in game mode. I almost ignored this model entirely, and that would have been a massive mistake. Samsung and LG are genuinely panicking right now because of this exact TV. But hold on. If you're already reaching for your phone to check the current price because the spec sheet promises 1,500 nits and over 1,000 local dimming zones, just pause for a second. Because what they don't show you in the big box showroom is what happens to this specific processor when you feed it a heavily compressed 720p football broadcast, or the fact that dealing with customer support for the dreaded panel lottery is an absolute nightmare. I buy these displays with my own money so we can tear apart the marketing hype without a brand rep breathing down my neck. If you appreciate independent testing that protects your wallet, hit subscribe. NextGen Picks. Now, here's where it gets weird. Let's talk about the dirty screen effect. Zoom out for a second and look at exactly how we got here. 5 years ago, if you wanted a television that could hit 1,000 nits of peak brightness without turning the shadows into a gray, washed-out mess, you were handing over at least $2,000 to Sony or Samsung. You were either buying an early generation OLED and praying it didn't suffer from burn-in after a year of watching news channels, or you were buying a flagship QLED with a massive full-array local dimming backlight. That was just the toll you paid to cross the bridge into high-end HDR. But then, the manufacturing side shifted. The massive Chinese fabrication plants, specifically CSOT and BOE, started pumping out VA panels with incredibly dense Mini LED backlights for pennies on the dollar. Suddenly, brands like Hisense and TCL could buy the exact same raw hardware that the premium guys were using, slap a plastic shell on it, and sell it for $800 at Best Buy. It sounds like a total victory for us, right? Well, not exactly. Because while they democratized the panel hardware, they completely gutted the silicon. The component that actually costs manufacturers the most money isn't the glass anymore. It's the system on a chip. That is the processor that runs the operating system, handles the motion interpolation, and figures out how to map a heavily compressed Netflix stream onto a 4K grid. When you buy a Hisense U8 at that $800 sweet spot, you are getting an absolute light cannon of a display paired with a processor that struggles to clear its own memory. This is the reality of the value disruptor market. Day 1, you're blown away by the colors in a 4K YouTube demo. Month 6, you're unplugging the TV from the wall because the Google TV interface has frozen for the 3rd time. This week, and the EARC connection to your soundbar just decided to stop passing audio entirely. I know. That sounds like I'm contradicting myself after I just told you Samsung was terrified of this thing. Hear me out. Samsung isn't terrified because the Hisense is perfect. They are terrified because it is just good enough to make a normal buyer question why they should spend an extra $1,000 for a nameplate. Actually, wait, I need to be more specific about that operating system issue before we move on. Out of the box, Hisense runs Google TV, which is visually clean, but it is heavily subsidized by data collection. The moment you connect this TV to your home Wi-Fi, automatic content recognition kicks in. ACR actively scans the pixels on your screen, even if you were just playing a Blu-ray disc through a physical HDMI cable, to identify exactly what you are watching and serve you targeted ads on the home screen. This constant background processing taxes the already weak onboard memory. After 8 months of use, that 8GB storage chip fills up with cached ad data, and suddenly it takes 4 seconds for the volume bar to appear after you press the button. My advice? Buy a $130 Apple TV 4K, plug it into HDMI 1, and never connect the physical television to the internet. When I had the 65-in U8 on my desk for 2 weeks, the thing that actually got to me wasn't the brightness. It is blindingly bright. Honestly, it pushes past 1,500 nits in a 10% window, which is bordering on painful if you're watching in a pitch-black room, but it makes daytime viewing with open blinds entirely viable at this price tier. But here is the catch that the spec sheet completely ignores. The local dimming algorithm is so aggressively tuned to turn off specific backlight zones and achieve perfect black levels that it routinely crushes fine shadow detail into oblivion. It's frustrating, and this is the part that genuinely frustrates me. Pushing that much light requires massive power, and power generates heat. After running a continuous loop of HDR test patterns for 45 minutes, the back plastic panel of the U8 chassis was physically hot to the touch. I'm talking over 105° F near the central venting. If you flush mount this specific model inside a tight recessed wall cavity in your living room, you are going to trap that heat, bake the internal power supply, and degrade the quantum dot phosphor layer prematurely. That is exactly why so many of these high output budget displays end up broken on Craigslist with dead mainboards after 36 months. The marketing materials never mention thermal management, but it dictates the lifespan of your purchase. The panel lottery is another massive unspoken tax on these budget disruptors because Hisense is aggressively hitting that $800 price point. Their quality assurance tolerances at the factory are noticeably looser than LG's or Sony's. During my testing, I loaded up a standard 50% gray uniformity slide, which perfectly simulates what you see when a camera pans across a hockey rink or a football field. The screen looked like someone had dragged dirty fingers straight down the middle of the glass. This is the dirty screen effect, or DSE. If you primarily watch cable sports on Sunday, those static dark bands will drive you absolutely insane every time the quarterback throws a pass. I'll admit a limitation of my own testing right here. I only bought 2 of these retail units, so maybe I just got unlucky twice in a row with the screen uniformity. But based on the massive volume of return data I track across independent AVS forums, I don't think I did. This actually brings up a point where I know half of you will violently disagree with me. If I have exactly $900 to spend today and my primary use case is watching compressed 1080i sports and older Blu-rays, I'm taking a 65-inch Sony X90L over the Hisense U8 every single time. Yes, the Sony has fewer dimming zones and noticeably more blooming around bright objects, but Sony's XR processor actually knows how to clean up a messy cable feed without making the players look like plastic action figures. Which side of that trade-off do you fall on? Drop your preference in the comments. Are you chasing peak brightness and raw specs, or do you prioritize processing and clean motion? I'm genuinely curious what you guys prioritize when the budget is strictly locked. That spec sheet reads like a dating profile. Impressive until you meet it in person. You get it out of the box, plug it in, and realize the remote has 4 dedicated buttons for streaming services that will probably be bankrupt by next Tuesday. The marketing team earned their bonus on those 144 Hz refresh rate claims though. They plaster it everywhere. But let me explain that better. If you're hooking up a PlayStation 5 or an Xbox Series X, the console is capping out at 120 Hz anyway. So that 144 Hz number is strictly for the 3 people dragging a high-end gaming PC into their living room. What actually matters for console gamers is how the TV handles variable refresh rate. Day 1, it's great. Month 6 is where the cracks show. When you engage VRR on the U8 to stop screen tearing during a heavy gaming session, the TV's processor gets completely overwhelmed. To keep the input lag down around that 13 ms mark, the TV secretly disables half of its local dimming zones. Your deep, immersive black levels instantly wash out into a milky gray. This is exactly the kind of hidden engineering trade-off that brands bury in the fine print. Then there's the audio situation. I keep coming back to this, and I'm not sure why it bothers me so much, but brands continue to advertise these built-in 2.1.2 Dolby Atmos speaker systems on flat panels. Physics simply does not allow a half-inch thick plastic chassis to displace enough air to create meaningful bass. The U8 gets loud, sure. It hits 85 dB without much distortion, but the dialogue clarity completely falls apart in busy action scenes because the rear-firing speakers are bouncing sound off your drywall before it ever reaches your ears. You are virtually required to spend another $300 on a dedicated soundbar, which immediately pushes that $800 bargain price over the $1,000 mark. If you factor in the external streaming box I mentioned earlier, your actual 5-year total cost of ownership is sitting right around $250. It is why I test this stuff the way I do, focusing on how the hardware actually behaves when you put it under real stress in a normal living room instead of a showroom. Before we move on to how this physically compares to its biggest rivals, let me know down below what specific monitor, soundbar, or appliance you want me to buy and tear apart next. I read every single one of those suggestions to figure out our testing schedule. But that's not even the part I wanted to discuss today. The real shocker comes when you put this Hisense U8 up against the TCL QM8 and try to figure out which one is actually telling the truth about their contrast ratios. Fast forward 6 months from your purchase date, you aren't watching pristine 4K demo reels of slow-motion honey dripping from a spoon. You are watching a terribly compressed Thursday night football stream on Amazon Prime, or maybe an old episode of The Office on Peacock. This is the reality where raw spec sheets go to die. We need to measure how these displays handle the messy, imperfect content we actually consume daily. I lined up the Hisense U8 directly against its main rival, the TCL QM8, the processing-focused Sony X90L, and the entry-level LG B4 OLED. I wanted to see exactly where the money goes when you shift between these 4 radically different approaches to image processing. I tested the Hisense U8 side by side with the 65-inch TCL QM8, and within the first 10 minutes, a massive difference in firmware philosophy emerged. Both are Chinese-manufactured light cannons costing around $900, but they treat shadows completely differently. Remember what I said earlier about Hisense aggressively shutting off dimming zones and crushing dark details to prevent blooming? TCL takes the opposite route. The QM8 tries to preserve every single shadow detail, but their electro-optical transfer function, basically the internal instruction manual dictating how bright a specific pixel should be, is noticeably off. It routinely over-brightens midtones. A dark, moody cave scene suddenly looks like someone turned on a fluorescent floodlight just off camera. They both fail, just in opposite directions, which means you're forced to choose between losing details in the dark or watching a movie that looks artificially brightened, almost like a daytime soap opera, which completely ruins the cinematic intent of the director. Let's bring this back to your actual living room and look at the Sony X90L. This display currently sits around $1,200 for a 65-inch model, and on paper, it looks like a terrible deal. It uses a standard full-array local dimming backlight with under 100 zones, while the Hisense brags about having over 1,000. If you read the internet forums, people will tell you the Sony is obsolete. I spent way too long analyzing this exact matchup. My family has concerns about my sanity at this point. But when you feed both TVs a notoriously dark and heavily compressed broadcast, like the famous Long Night episode from Season 8 of Game of Thrones, the Sony completely destroys the Hisense in motion clarity and artifact reduction. The XR processor inside the X90L actively smooths out color gradients, preventing that chunky, blocky color banding you see in dark skies on cheaper panels. But you pay a serious physical penalty for that processing supremacy. Because Sony relies on so few physical dimming zones, their algorithms simply cannot contain the light around bright objects on a black screen. If you watch movies with white subtitles, you will see a massive, distracting gray halo bleeding into the black letterbox bars at the bottom of the screen. It is an unavoidable physical limitation of having fewer zones. Now you're probably thinking, wait, didn't you just say OLED fixes all of this? Let me refine that explanation a bit, because the LG B4 OLED is often thrown into this exact budget conversation. Yes, it fixes the blooming entirely. Every single pixel generates its own light, so a white subtitle sits right next to a pitch black pixel with absolutely zero light bleed. It is visually perfect in a dark basement. But if you put the LG B4 in a normal living room with uncovered south-facing windows, the panel simply cannot generate enough sustained full-screen brightness to overcome the glare. The image looks flat, dim, and incredibly hard to see during a Sunday afternoon football game. This is where I know half of you will violently disagree with me, and I want to hear your arguments below. I firmly believe that buying a pure OLED like the LG B4 for a bright family living room is a mistake for 80% of American buyers. Between the aggressive ambient light washing out the screen and the lingering, albeit reduced anxiety of permanent burn-in from leaving ESPN on for 6 hours a day, the ownership experience is just too stressful. Are you willing to babysit your television to get perfect black levels, or do you prefer the brute force brightness of a mini LED where you never have to worry about static logos burning into the glass? Tell me if this matches your experience if you've owned an OLED for more than a year. I almost didn't include this next part, but it actually matters more than I expected: firmware updates and long-term stability. When you buy the Sony or the LG, their software updates are generally boring and stable. They fix minor bugs. When you buy the TCL or the Hisense, every major firmware update feels like a terrifying roll of the dice. Remember that variable refresh rate issue I mentioned earlier where the local dimming gets disabled on the Hisense? Last October, a firmware update on a competing model temporarily broke the 4K 120Hz processing entirely on the Xbox port, cutting the vertical resolution exactly in half. It took them weeks to patch it. That is the hidden tax. You are the beta tester. You are buying hardware that is genuinely capable of incredible things, but the software team is constantly playing catch-up, trying to patch memory leaks and HDMI handshake failures long after your return window has closed. And here's another bizarre engineering quirk on the Hisense U8 that drives me absolutely up the wall. They advertise two HDMI 2.1 ports capable of handling high-bandwidth 4K gaming. That is technically true, but they assigned the EARC audio return channel to one of those high-bandwidth ports. So, if you plug your brand new Dolby Atmos soundbar into the EARC port like you're supposed to, you just lost half of your gaming capacity. You now only have one port left for your PS5, meaning your Xbox Series X or gaming PC gets relegated to a slower 60Hz port. LG and Samsung figured out years ago to put the EARC on a separate lower bandwidth port. It's a tiny, maddening oversight that ruins the setup process for gamers with multiple consoles. We also need to address structural failure modes. When I track repair patterns over a 3-year span, these high-nit Chinese panels don't usually fail at the LED level. They fail at the T-Con board. The timing controller board gets subjected to massive sustained thermal loads because the chassis simply isn't thick enough to properly dissipate the heat generated by pushing 2,000 nits of brightness. If you're buying a TCL QM8 or Hisense U8, I strongly advise plugging it into a dedicated high-joule surge protector, not a cheap power strip. Voltage. Fluctuations will fry these main boards much faster than they will a Sony. These are the things you only discover when you actually try to live with these devices instead of just staring at them in a showroom. The marketing promises you the world for $800. The reality is a series of constant compromises. You sacrifice processing for brightness on the Hisense. You sacrifice color accuracy for shadow detail on the TCL. You sacrifice dimming zones and contrast for supreme processing on the Sony. And you sacrifice daytime usability and peace of mind for perfect blacks on the LG OLED. If you've made it this far, you realize there is no perfect, there is only the right television for the specific room you are putting it in and the specific content you actually watch daily. Next, we need to completely organize this mess. I'm going to break down exactly which buyer profile fits which display, give you my definitive best overall and best value picks, and tell you exactly when you should walk away from this category entirely. Everything I just said, it almost doesn't matter, because your physical living room layout makes the decision for you before you even walk into a Best Buy. If you have a massive open concept floor plan with huge uncovered windows, you are the exact buyer the TCL QM8 and Hisense U8 were engineered for. I'll give them credit for this one thing though. When that afternoon sun hits the glass directly at 3 p.m., an entry-level OLED becomes a 65-inch mirror reflecting your coffee table right back at you. The Hisense U8 at roughly $900 simply blasts through that glare with brute force, maintaining over 1,000 nits of sustained full-screen brightness. It is visually violent, but it works. Now you're probably thinking, wait, didn't you just spend the last 20 minutes tearing apart their software and local dimming algorithms? I did, and I stand by all of it. Because if you control the light in your room, those exact flaws become glaringly obvious the second you turn on a moody Netflix thriller. The Hisense is the ultimate college football party television for a bright Sunday afternoon, but it is a deeply compromised home theater display. When I tested the Sony X90L side by side with the Hisense in my own basement for 3 straight weeks, the hardware numbers actually showed a massive deficit for Sony. The X90L maxed out around 1,200 nits. The Hisense easily cleared 1,500. But within the first 10 minutes of watching a notoriously dark sequence, specifically the opening rain scene of the Batman, the Sony felt like a premium product, while the Hisense felt like a very bright, over-sharpened computer monitor. I stopped looking for panel uniformity flaws on the Sony and just watched the movie. Sony's XR processor understands what a film grain structure is supposed to look like, leaving it intact instead of smoothing it out into a blurry, plasticky mess. It just is. This brings up a massive split in how people spend their money, and I want you to vote down in the comments to settle this. The 65-inch Sony X90L costs about $300 more than the Hisense U8. You are paying a premium purely for the invisible brain inside the television while actively sacrificing peak brightness and accepting a bit more light blooming around subtitles. Is superior motion processing and upscaling worth a 25% price hike? Or do you take the raw hardware power of the Hisense and live with the software quirks? Tell me where you land. I read every single comment to figure out where the community's head is at. Actually, let me revise that slightly before I hand out the final awards. If we strictly look at the math, the Best Value Award has to go to the Hisense U8. Getting full-array Mini LED technology with 144 Hz panel support for under $900 is mathematically absurd. But you have to buy it knowing exactly how to bypass its engineering traps. Remember that infuriating EARC port issue I mentioned earlier, where Hisense forces you to choose between your Dolby Atmos soundbar and your Xbox Series X. You bypass that by running your consoles directly through a dedicated AV receiver, or you just accept playing your secondary console at 60 Hz. If you know the limitations, you can exploit the value. My best overall pick, the display that I would confidently buy for my own parents without worrying about receiving a panicked tech support phone call during Thanksgiving, is the Sony X90L. I spent way too long trying to find a fatal flaw in the Sony, and the worst thing I can say is that the plastic legs feel incredibly cheap. Buy a $50 Visa mount, problem solved. It upscales terrible 720p cable signals beautifully. The motion handling during live sports is mathematically perfect, and the strict QA tolerances at the factory mean you are significantly less likely to lose the dirty screen effect lottery. Okay, let's bring this back to your actual wallet and the truth about this entire industry. You might overpay, you might get the wrong panel technology for your room, but the absolute worst thing you can do is buy a display based on the operating system sticker printed on the cardboard box. Day 1, it flies. Year 3, it dies. Every single native smart TV interface, whether it's Google TV, Roku, or Tizen, will inevitably degrade into a sluggish, ad-filled, memory-leaking nightmare within 36 months. Do not factor the smart interface into your purchasing decision. The truth bomb here is simple. Assume the internal brain of your new TV has an expiration date. Your $890 television practically requires a $130 Apple TV 4K or an NVIDIA to actually feel like a premium device over a 5-year lifespan. Buy the display for its physical glass panel, its local dimming algorithm, and its physical port layout. Buy a dedicated external streaming box to handle the software and the Wi-Fi. That completely isolates you from a manufacturer deciding to push a forced firmware update in 2028 that bricks your home screen with unskippable video advertisements. If you're ready to pull the trigger and upgrade your living room, I've put links to the specific vetted models in the description below. These aren't the gray market variants or last year's hardware disguised with a slightly altered serial number to trick you. They point directly to the safe retail versions we physically verified, specifically the exact US market VA panel units that completely bypass the terrible wide-angle IPS panel downgrade that some retailers try to sneak into the lower size tiers. Using those links helps fund the channel, so we can buy the next batch of hardware with our own money. without ever taking brand sponsorships or script approvals. You don't have to buy a $2,000 flagship to get an incredible cinematic experience anymore. The gap between the mid-range and the ultra-premium has never been tighter in the history of consumer displays. But the brands know that, and they are intentionally hiding their aggressive cost-cutting measures in the silicon, the quality control, and the software updates, hoping you are too blinded by the massive peak brightness numbers on the box to notice the stuttering motion and the crushed shadow details. Do the research. Measure your room's actual ambient lighting. Protect your budget. Drop your setup in the comments. I'm genuinely curious what you're running right now and if it's surviving the test of time. I'll see you in the next one.